Hey everyone, it's Dollipop. Today I have another installment in my monthly tutorial series, which is all about how to color and shade magical crystals. So here we go. The first thing is that I have my crystals on a separate layer above my character. The first step obviously is going to be filling the line art with a color other than black. I chose a dark purple. Always color your line art, number one way to make your digital art pop. The next thing is going to be creating the base layer underneath. I chose this nice bright blue for my base layer because it just screamed crystal to me. And actually all of the colors that I chose for this picture, I chose them because I wanted to incorporate them in the crystals. I thought that the blues and the pinks would go great together. So I also group these into a folder just for ease of access. So the next thing that you're going to do is I like to take a soft watercolor-like brush and I hand paint a gradient on the base of the crystals. I decided to go with this dark purple just to provide a little bit of contrast. So you can see me brushing on that hand-painted gradient. Next, I'm going to take this kind of bold purple and do a little bit more contrast at the very base of the crystal. This kind of gives it like a little bit of a magic glow coming from the bottom right off the bat. Gives it a little bit more interesting of a color. If you look at real pictures of crystals, they tend to have that cloudiness at the bottom, so I wanted to incorporate that. I'm also continuing on and painting a nice bright highlight color with this yellow from my palette just to kind of give things a little bit of an iridescent look. Yellows and blues and pinks together always kind of scream, you know, iridescent magical crystals to me. So after that, I'm going to create a new layer and set it to multiply, and I'm going to use that to shade the crystals. I'm going to take my normal shading brush, which is a hard round brush, and I'm going to take the original blue color of the crystal, or whatever color your crystal originally was. I switched to purple, yeah. So take a dark color and really whatever color you want and just begin to shade. For a more interesting look, you could even shade with a purple or a pink. That would give it kind of like a lot of dynamic different colors happening. Since the layer is set to multiply, you're going to want to make sure that it's a pretty saturated color, but that you are kind of looking and seeing what you're doing while you're shading so it doesn't get muddy. Which is why sometimes I avoid multiply layers because they can get a little bit muddy. But for this, I kept it blue. I kept it within my color palette, which is why I was able to kind of keep the colors very distinct. So after you finish doing all your shading, and as you can see, I have the layer contents selected to make sure that I color in the lines. You can use layer masks, they'll do the same thing, but for me personally, I enjoy doing it this way with selections. After that, you're going to reduce the opacity of the multiply layer to somewhere, I think I did it around 50%. So you can still see where the shading is. You can see as I zoom out, you can actually see where the shading is, but it's not as bold. Next, I'm going to create a layer and set it to screen, and I'm going to paint some highlights with my same little brush. I originally was going to do this with the yellow, but then as you can see, I selected to do it with the pink instead because I thought it just provided a little bit more visual interest. So as you can see, I'm just kind of figuring out where the light would catch, and I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to reduce the opacity. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add even more highlights with a screen layer as well. For these highlights, I'm actually going to be using a softer brush, my watercolor brush, and I'm just going to paint on some highlights to kind of define the forms of the crystals a little bit more, just so you can see all of their edges and nooks and crannies and stuff like that. And again, using the selection tool to kind of erase the extras, which I'm going to do again in a little bit because I'm going to eventually be applying a blur to these. So as you can see, I'm just highlighting everywhere where light would go and including some backlighting, which as you probably know by now, I love doing backlighting. So after all of the highlights are done, I'm going to apply a blur. And the way I do that is go to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian Blur. Gaussian blur is one of my most used tools. As you can see, I'm just kind of like playing around with it here, seeing how much of a blur I want to use. After that, I'm using my selection tool and inverting the selection to delete all the extras, of course. I also adjusted the opacity at first, but then I decided to keep it at 100% opacity because I liked the way it looked. And that just kind of gave like another little mystical kind of glow to the crystals a bit that I really enjoy, and I like how it looks. So next, I'm going to do some fractures in the crystals, and this is kind of a technique that I developed kind of on the spot just with experimentation. So at first I knew I wanted the layer to be on overlay or multiply rather, but I do change it back to normal just so I can see what I'm doing. And so basically, this is kind of me experimenting real quick, but basically the thought process behind this was that I wanted to do those crystalline fractures that you see in crystals, but I didn't want to have to kind of like render each one individually. So what I did was, this also gave me a chance to bring in a lot of the other colors from my palette. So I just took a soft brush and made some hatching marks in all of the colors in my palette besides the highlighting color. And then I went to filter, pixelate, and crystallize. So then what I did was I kind of increased the cell size until I had some pixeling and some hard edges. As you can see, it looks just like fractures. Then I moved the layer beneath the shading, but still over top the base crystal layer. I did end up setting it to multiply after fiddling with it. And then I reduced the opacity a bit. As you can see, it gives it like a little bit of a subtle effect, but I think it turned out really, really cool. So the next thing I did to kind of give everything, tie everything in a little bit, was I thought that these lines were a little too dark for what the crystals were. So I ended up, as you can see, changing them to be a little bit lighter. I also opted to color in the inside lines of the crystals with an even lighter tone, just so they looked more natural. Sometimes I'll do this on every object in the piece, but for now I really just wanted to focus on the crystals. So I decided to just kind of color in the inside lines, and as you can see, I'm also kind of adjusting where the jewelry is and things like that. But yeah, definitely this line contrast helped make them look kind of a little bit more natural, like crystals. So as you can see, I'm just finishing up the line art here, coloring it. And then after the line art, I decided that I wanted a couple more little effects. So one thing I decided to add is I decided to add a little bit of even more sharp highlights, because I love when things are glistening and, full of highlights and sparkly and stuff like that. And if you're gonna have jewelry made of crystals, you're gonna want them to sparkle. So I just took my little highlight color and I applied some sharp highlights just on places where the light would catch, and some places where maybe the light wouldn't catch, but I have a hard time resisting putting lots of sparkles on. I opted to keep these above the line art as well, because I feel like if you do your final sparkles above the line art, it just kind of makes it look even more luminous, and like they're really catching the light. So the next thing I opted to do after my highlight was I wanted to do a little bit of texture in the crystal. So I got like a little star brush that I had downloaded, and I just drew some speckles and some kind of graininess, almost to look like little magical motes or like little sparkles within the crystal. So after I drew them, I used my selection tool again to make sure that they didn't bleed, although it would look kind of cute if all the sparkles were on top of everything, but maybe I'll do that in a future crystal drawing, but for these I wanted to keep them contained. I also moved the sparkles to underneath the multiply layers as well, just so they blended in a little bit better. And the very last thing I decided to do is I decided to add a bit of a glow to the crystals themselves. So I put a new layer on top of everything, even the line art, and I use a very soft brush and I just kind of painted some glow along the crystals. And as you can see, I used that pink just to kind of like bring it into the palette, and because it was like a little softer than the purple that I had drawn inside the crystals with. And instead of reducing the opacity, as you can see, I kind of just applied a blur to it, because that way you could still see it. But yeah, so that was the final technique I used to kind of make these crystals look a little more magical. And I think in the end, it turned out really, really good. I'm quite pleased with all the things that I kind of figured out myself as I was going. But yeah, so hopefully this didn't go too fast. I know I talk really fast, so if you have any questions, make sure to let me know. And you can also actually see the PDF format for this tutorial by being a member of my Patreon. Anyone at the $5 or above tier gets access to monthly tutorials in PDF format. And the PDF goes into a little bit more detail than the video does about the techniques shown. And this month it also gives a little mini tutorial on how I shade gold and metallics, as well as a step-by-step of the entire image. So yeah, I think that's about it. If you like what you see, feel free to check out my Patreon. I have tiers that start at just $1 a month for wallpapers, sketches, and all kinds of fun stuff like that. Other than that, don't forget to like and subscribe, and have an awesome day.